Hi, my name's Jay and I'm a game developer. After July 24th, 2018, I can actually call myself that because I finished developing my first game and I published it on itch.io. It's called 2 Hour Bullet Hell, and I'm not going to lie to you, it's a piece of crap. It's a vertical space shooter where you shoot at ninja stars that spawn at random positions at the top of the screen. Every 10 seconds, the spawn rate of the ninja stars increases, which means it's unlikely that you could survive forever. Speaking of which, if you get hit 3 times, the game is over and the application suddenly closes. So, why does this game suck so much? Well, it's because it was my first game that I finished in over 10 years, but it's also because I limited myself to just 2 hours of development. In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of my thought process while I embarked on this bizarre little project, tell you about some of the lessons I learned on the way, and tell you about why this little project was such an important step in my career as a game developer. So, why the heck would I restrict myself to just 2 hours of game development? Game development is a long and complicated process, even for independent studios. The developers of the indie masterpiece Hollow Knight spent over 3 years in development, and that game wasn't even in a beta stage until over a year of development. So, if I really want to make a great game, why would I place such a crazy time restriction on myself? If I actually wanted to make a great game, wouldn't I want to spend years at my computer bringing my dream project into fruition? My answer is, not right now. I have 2 reasons for this. The first reason is that restriction breeds creativity. This might sound counterintuitive at first, but hear me out. Dilla was a hip-hop beat maker who died in 2006. In 2002, he was diagnosed with an incurable terminal illness that I can't pronounce. His health seriously started to deteriorate in 2005, and he wound up spending many of his final days in and out of hospitals. However, this was also when he started working on an album called Donuts, one of the most unique and awe-inspiring hip-hop records of all time. His mother recalls seeing him working hard on the project even while he was in bed in the hospital. The restriction of numbered days to continue living and the bizarre music production environment of a hospital gave rise to an extremely creative and intriguing album. For those of you who don't like hip-hop, here's an example from the gaming world. Think of the platforming genre. There are a few classic titles that come to mind. Super Mario World, Mega Man 2, and Celeste are some good ones that I can think of. These games are defined by their tight and responsive controls for jumping around on platforms. But what would happen if you made a platforming game where you weren't allowed to jump? You would get a game like VVVVVV, the platforming game where you have to change the direction of gravity to navigate platforms. The odd restriction of making a platformer where you can't jump gave rise to another classic indie title that was unique and memorable. So, you can say that the restriction of 2 hours to develop a game was a way to force myself to get creative and stay focused. Indeed, the 2 hours I spent developing 2 Hour Bullet Hell were 2 of the most productive hours of my life. The second reason I would restrict myself to just 2 hours is that I have qualms with calling myself a game developer when I don't actually have any games published for other people to play. Before 2 Hour Bullet Hell, the last game that I finished developing was a Pac-Man clone with my head as Pac-Man. I made it in 2006 when I was 13 years old using an old program called Mark Overmars Game Maker, which is now known as Game Maker Studio. I've always wanted to be a game developer ever since I was a little kid. I love games, and I love designing game mechanics, pixel art, code, and music. However, I'm not a little kid anymore, and my hard drive is full of unfinished game development projects. I was working on an adventure platformer when you play as a mouse that fights giant cats. I was working on a Metroidvania game where you use a yo-yo as a grappling hook. I was also working on a top-down maze game where enemies only move when you do. All of these game ideas are really cool, and I'm really proud of the prototypes that I have for them. However, they're all kind of tragic in a way. They represent my hopes and dreams as a game developer. They represent these massive dream projects that I had in mind, elegant cathedrals of code, gameplay mechanics, pixel art, and nice music and sound effects. However, none of them ever came to fruition. Why not? I believe it's because I don't have enough experience as a game developer to actually finish one of these projects. My knowledge of game development is rather skewed. I'm really great at starting new projects. I can come up with fun and interesting gameplay mechanics, dream up beautiful fantasy realms, and even program some tight platforming controls. The problem is that things don't get much farther than that. I start to realize that I've bit off more than I can chew, and my projects start to get so big that I can't even imagine how I'm ever going to finish them. The prospect of actually getting the game to a playable state seemed like an impossible dream. However, it's not all bad. I've gotten some good practice with drawing pixel art, I've acquired a lot of reusable and extensible code from these projects, and I've gained a lot of knowledge of Unity, my current game engine of choice. What I don't have practice with is actually finishing a game. I want to gain more knowledge about the later stages of game development, the playtesting, the closing up of the core gameplay loop, the squashing of bugs, and the building of the project into a playable executable file. A 2-hour game development frenzy seemed like a good way to condense that experience into something that I can actually manage, and I wound up learning a lot about game development from just making this crappy little space shooter game. And now I can finally say that I actually am a game developer, and my first title is 2-Hour Bullet Hell. It's not a great game by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a finished game, and I bet the next one that I finish will be even better. I learned a lot during my 2-hour game dev session. Luckily for you, I recorded the whole thing, so you can learn from some of my mistakes. In this part of the video, I'll go over some of the more interesting parts of the process, and I hope you get something out of it. The first thing I did in my empty Unity project was import a package of code called Spanner. Spanner is an open source library of custom Unity engine extensions that I've been writing with a friend. The only 2 extensions in the package so far are an object pooling system and a system for managing health. I figured this project would be a perfect way to test out our tools in a real game development setting, and it might even give me ideas for new features or show me bugs that I missed before. I'm glad that I did this because I actually did end up catching a bug at the very end of the session, where my object pooling system wouldn't be included in the final build. I fixed it now, but that was a scary moment. Overall, this showed me another valuable lesson, that extensions and tools for the Unity engine, even custom ones that I wrote, speed up the development process enormously. The fact that I had an extensible health system meant that I didn't have to program any enemy or player health manager. I hope to develop more tools like this in between my game projects. If you're like me and you have a bunch of unfinished projects, try making some tools from your old projects that you can use in future ones. It could end up saving you a lot of time. I learned about the importance of user interfaces, or UI. User interfaces are the elements of your game that communicate unobvious information to the player, like your current health, your score, how much time has elapsed, stuff like that. I really wish I had spent more time developing basic UI. In the end of the 2-hour session, I wound up rushing to get a simple health display system running, where there are 3 hearts on screen that represent the remaining health the player has. That's pretty important information for the player to know during gameplay, and I'm glad that I was able to get it implemented in time. However, I wish that I had spent time developing some other basic UI elements like the number of enemies the player has killed, or the time the game has been going on for. In future projects, I'll likely put more time into deciding what information the player needs to know and making that information easily accessible. I learned about the convenience of template files for your development environment. Over the course of this project, I realized that I added a child class to almost every component I programmed that represented the serialized settings for that component. I realized that I do this in a lot of components for a lot of my projects, but for this project it became especially apparent how repetitive it was. I created space for a settings class at the top of my components so often, I figured it might as well have been automated. Now, I have 2 separate template files in Visual Studio, my chosen development environment. One that creates a blank Unity component class without the settings class, and one that creates a blank Unity component class with the settings class. Now, I'll never have to waste another moment writing out public class settings, curly braces, marking the class as serializable, and creating a public member for the class. If you don't know what any of that stuff means, that's okay. The technical aspects of how C# and the Unity engine work aren't the point here. The point is that anything that you can do to automate repetitive, time-consuming tasks is worth it. It only took me a minute or so to generate the template file for this component with the settings class, but it could save me hours in development time on future projects if you consider that it took me 5 to 10 seconds for every single component. Larger projects will have hundreds and hundreds of components, so hopefully you can see just how much time this will save me in the long run. I learned about letting go of the perfect architecture you have dreamed up in your head when you're about to write lines of code. This was me writing the component responsible for moving the ship when the player presses the arrow keys on the keyboard. You don't need to understand the code at all to see that I wasted a lot of time fumbling around here. There were several times when I started writing something that would have worked just fine, but I wound up backpedaling because I knew there was a cleaner, prettier looking answer, or maybe even a more efficient one. The lesson here is that this was not a good way to manage my time. I should have taken the first solution that worked and just rolled with it, even if it wasn't optimal or pretty looking. I think that readable, optimized code is a great thing to work towards, but it's not an appropriate goal for a 2-hour development project. Optimizing and organizing code is something that you can always come back to, and I think it's more appropriate to do it in between big rushes of creative development. It was far more important that I get a playable game than it was for me to get an optimized or organized one in this scenario. You're never going to write the perfect code when you take your first stab at it, so you might as well just write imperfect code and come back later to improve it when you have more time to focus on stuff like that. This aspect of time management leads me to the most important lesson I learned during this development session. I could have managed my time a lot better by not caring about artwork at all. Now, I know what you're thinking. The art in my game is crap. And you're right. However, even though it's crap, I spent way too much time on it. I spent almost a minute drawing a pure black background in GIMP when I could have just used a black skybox in Unity's built-in camera component. I spent another minute in GIMP drawing a triangle that wound up becoming the player in the game. I spent a whopping 4.5 minutes drawing a bullet sprite in GIMP, which could have just been a plain old white square, but instead I had to make a fancy little dot shape. In the most extreme example, I spent almost 10 minutes drawing out each frame of a 3-frame animation for the enemies in the game. An inanimate red box would have been just fine for the enemies, but I went for something fancy and was too pressed for time to make it look that good anyway. When I watch this part of the development process, it just makes me cringe. I also spent another 3 minutes playing with the Unity animator to get the animation to play as the enemy moved down the screen. Oddly enough, when I look back, my proudest moment artistically was when I drew this crappy little heart at the very end when I was really pressed for time. They look like Valentine's cards from a hyperactive kindergartner, but you can tell what it means in the context of the game, and it only took about 20 seconds to draw it. My point isn't that games shouldn't have good artwork. I do think that games should have good artwork. My point is that it was far too early in the game development process to be putting any thought towards making good artwork. If you structure your game project nicely, artwork should be something that you can add on to the game without changing the way that you play the game. For a 2-hour game project, I think it's more important that my game is actually playable than it is that my game looks pretty. Overall, I spent roughly 20 minutes on the artwork and animations for the game, and I still think some 4-year-olds could do a better job than I did. Just to let this point really sink in, 20 minutes is almost 17% of the entire 2 hours. That's almost a quarter of the entire development process that I spent on these primitive cave drawings. I think it's safe to say that 17% of the project time would have been enough time to add more UI elements, such as a player's score or a timer to show you how long you've survived. Maybe I could have even developed a simple menu that displays when you die, giving you the option to retry or quit instead of just having the application abruptly close when you die. The art would have looked worse, but I think the game would have been more fun to play. Now, I'm probably being a little too hard on myself with some of these points. It's all too easy to criticize a game that was hastily slammed into existence in such a short time frame. However, I know I won't learn anything from the experience unless I point out what I could have done better, and I think every one of these lessons are now tools that I have in my toolbox when I go forward with bigger and more complex projects. Okay, so I finished my first game in over 10 years. That's all well and good, but what do I do now? Well, the obvious answer is make more games. Now that I know I can complete a game in 2 hours, there's no excuses for me not to make another one. I plan on doing more 2-hour game development sessions, and I'll gladly post the experiences on YouTube like I did before. I'm sure that my skills will improve the more projects I have under my belt. Who knows? Maybe one day I'll end up making one that's actually kind of fun to play, and I can come back to it later and improve it. If I can make the core mechanics of a game fun and engaging in just 2 hours, then I know that all I have to do after that is just add polish to the artwork, build interesting levels, add sound effects and awesome music, and improve player quality of life through convenient menus and UI. Okay, I know it's really not going to be that simple, but it will be much easier to stay motivated about a project that I already know is fun than it will be to try and make this perfect dream game I have in my head become a reality. This has been Jay with a 2-hour game development session. I hope you enjoyed looking through this with me, and I hope to make some more content for you soon. See you later.